Certainly good to be able to be back home and with you, and tonight anyway. Got some gospel meetings coming up. They're going to get me kind of busy as well in the next few weeks. But good to be able to come back home. I was telling somebody when I got back home Monday, and originally that trip was planned to be a Monday through Saturday, so I wouldn't miss a Sunday in the mix of that. And when the school calendar changed, and we kind of changed those plans. But when I got home Monday, I was thankful that wasn't Saturday, and I needed to preach on Sunday. So it worked out in some ways to the betterment in regards to those things. We're going to start a study of the book of Jeremiah, and for benefit of understanding the book of Jeremiah, you can put your lesson sheets away for a little while, because I think we need to walk through about 200 years of history in about 30 minutes or so tonight, and because we got to frame it. I think if we just jump right into Jeremiah and don't understand where Jeremiah fits in the picture, that won't benefit us a whole lot. We kind of need to understand, where does Jeremiah fit, what's going on, what has happened prior. Now, I'm not going to back you up to Adam. We won't go that far. But I do want to at least back up and talk a little bit about the fall of Israel. We'll back up and talk a little bit about the fall of Judah, which is in particular germane to the study of Jeremiah. And hopefully this will set the stage for us to be able to have a healthy discussion about the book itself. Jeremiah, by the way, is the longest book in the Bible, word for word, I believe. I believe there is more words in the book of Jeremiah than any other book. Now, chapters is the book of Psalms, right? But we're talking about words, not just chapters. We're talking about words. And so I say that to mention to you that we're probably not going to be able to cover all of it in 3 months. We'll probably be 2 quarters covering this material on Jeremiah. Probably at least, and hopefully no more than that. I think we can do it in 6 months, but I didn't feel like we, especially with VBS in the midst of that, and some, so wanted to be sure that we had time. So we're not going to rush through it. We'll spend the time we need to cover the material. But let's talk a little bit about the idea that, let me turn a couple things off I don't need. The history leading up to this moment that we're talking about here tonight. And so let's start with the fall of Jerusalem. When we're talking about fall of Jerusalem, or fall of Israel, I should say, we're talking about a time period that's discussed generally in 1 Kings chapter 12 through 2 Kings chapter 17. You're talking about a time period over a length of time. It didn't happen just bang, gone. It was a period of time and a period of different kinds of challenges and difficulties that created the problem that God eventually does away with Israel. And so as you think about Israel, remember they're the what in relationship to the divided kingdom? They're the northern part, okay? They're the northern kingdom, and they're going to eventually fall around 721 BC. Is the general date that kind of the final straw that has the fall of Israel. And these charts, by the way, if you've done, I think some of you have done Bob and Sandra Waldron's book on history and geography. If you've done this is a series of charts put together by a fellow by the name of Matt Henneke. And basically he adapts it off of that book on history and geography. And so I can't give you this. That's the point I'm making. I bought this, but it is copyrighted, and so I can't just give you this material that I'm showing you. But it saved me a lot of time not to have to redo it all. So here's the kingdom of Israel was doomed to have trouble. They never had a what? What kind of king? Never had a good one, okay? They never had a good one, and they were actually started out of trouble, right? 2 characters, who were they? Jeroboam and Rehoboam, right? And they're not agreeing on how the country or the nation should go. And the divided kingdom begins from troubled starts in some ways. Jeroboam did what? He built golden calves to worship instead of Jehovah. Why did he do that? They want to go back to Jerusalem, right? Jerusalem belongs to Judah. And I don't want them traveling down there and being influenced by Judah. I want them up here under my control. And so he created 2 places, one to the north, one to the south. They were Dan and Bethel, right? Is that correct? And so he creates these places for them to go and worship. So idolatry is a problem in Israel from its early going. And as each king followed, troubles just multiplied over time. Syria was a serious issue and problem to Israel. And if you look on the map to the right of the screen, you can see that Syria was basically up here to the north, and there were this contentious, constant kind of bickering and battle going on between the two, and there was this kind of constant problems that they had in relationship to Syria. Since the early days of Baasha, when King Asa of Judah hired Ben-Hadad of Syria to attack Israel's northern cities, problems grew. And the threat grew as Israel became more and more wicked. The more wicked they become, now who's against them? God. And the more God is against you, the more in trouble you are, right? The more challenged you become. And so God is involved. And so, though God uses nations and people to accomplish certain things, remember ultimately this whole thing is about God and His plans and His purposes and using men to fulfill them. Moab had rebelled against Israel when Ahab died. And again, I'm going to go fast because I don't want to spend weeks and weeks. We could spend weeks and weeks, but don't want to do that. There was a monument belonging to King Meshach of Moab called the Moabite Stone, and it was found. And it describes Moab's victories in both Israel and Judah. Several battles followed through the years, and Israel never regained more than temporary control. The only point I make by that is that there are some skeptics of this book, believe that or not, right? That can you believe it? That there are people who don't want to believe the Bible to be true and that it's historically inaccurate and all those accusations that people make. And so you can go to like these stones of this Moabite king. It shows the chronicles and monuments of the things, and within it, secular, separate and apart from biblical history, notations about his constant battles and challenges with both Israel and Judah, substantiating and corresponding with the very things the Bible teaches us. And so there is outside evidence. Don't let anybody ever tell you that the Bible stands completely alone. I'm willing to let it stand completely alone, by the way. My faith leads me to that end, that I'm willing to let it stand alone. But history bears out that it doesn't have to, because there's plenty of other pieces of history that share with us knowledge concerning these kinds of events. Jehu had opportunity to turn his people to God. Just didn't happen. After destroying Ahab's family and the Baal worshippers, he just kind of stopped. And he didn't fulfill all the purposes that he could have. And he goes right back to the gods of Jeroboam. And it just creates a continued problem for Israel. In 2 Kings chapter 10, verses 32 and 33, in those days the Lord began to cut off parts of Israel. And Hazael conquered in all the territory of Israel from the Jordan eastward, all the land of Gilead, Gad, Reuben, and Manasseh from Aroer, which is by the river Arnon, including Gilead and Bashan. And so here's the record of how they begin to fall in the hands of these foreign kings. Jehoahaz was as wicked as his father. When he comes into power, Israel just continued to lose ground after ground after ground. Was left with an army consisting of only 50 horsemen, 10 chariots, and about 10,000 foot soldiers. Not much of an army compared to the things that were going on around him. And on the brink of total destruction from Syria. He cried to Jehovah at this point for mercy when he had reached his lowest point. And God was merciful and delivered them for a period of time from Syria. But it didn't last long. Jehoahaz's son Jehoash had 3 victories over Syria. They began to temporarily kind of get some ground back. He pushed Israel. Jeroboam II followed that and pushed Israel's borders from Hamath to the northern tip of the Dead Sea. And so you can see from left to right, if you're looking at these, let me just run up here and point to it, because my laser is not very bright. But here's kind of the territory that Jehoahaz of Israel had, and then those that followed him expanded a little bit, but not for long. They ultimately are going to be taken down by the Syrians. Judah had a good king named Uzziah, who ruled at the same time as this Jeroboam II in Israel. And they controlled nearly as much land as David had once held. And so good things are happening in Judah while all this demise is occurring and challenges are happening in Israel. Judah still stands reasonably strong at this point in terms of their land, the things that they possessed and controlled. The Assyrians, and by the way, the Assyrians and the Syrians are not the same, okay? They are not the same. And remember that, and I'll try to point it out to you on a map here when the next one comes up that I can show it to you. But they're not the same. They're different entities. The Assyrians and the Syrians are two different people. In fact, they're the conflicts in relationship to them. The Assyrians had been in existence for many years. Their capital was at Nineveh. Why do we know Nineveh? That's Jonah, right? Jonah was sent to the great capital, Nineveh, of the Assyrians to be able to bring the message. Jonah didn't want to go. Why? Because they're cruel, okay? It's on the chart too. Because they were known for their cruelty and ruthlessness. The first to build an army able to conquer an extensive empire. In other words, they were the first. The Assyrians were kind of the first to build such a military power that they could really do empire building, where they could go out and really start to spread the borders unlike others had been able to in the past. And their interest in Syria and Palestine was only an effort to remove everything in their path toward Egypt. And so Assyria, way to the north, Syria below, Palestine, Egypt. And Assyrians wanted to do anything they could to make headway into Egypt, and they would take over anything they could in their path. Now, it's interesting though. God's going to use these people for a period of time, and then He'll be done with them, just like use the Babylonians, and What's interesting about all that to me is, I thought about this a little bit, especially this morning when I was looking through some of these things. You maybe wonder why in your mind, you think, why did God send Jonah to Nineveh? And you say, well, because God wanted them to repent. Okay, well, why did God want them to repent? Why the need for change? Why? And then you think about the fact that God's still using them. God's still got a purpose. Assyria was creating its own demise. They were imploding. Okay, they're a nation that was fighting, had civil wars, they had all kinds of conflict internally. And God had a purpose down here in the future for them. And so God sends Jonah and gets a level of repentance for a period of time to sustain them long enough to get them to the point where God can use them. Just think about it. I realize I don't have a verse that I can point you to, but when I think about the reasonings behind God's purposes, sometimes they're not as obvious as maybe we'd like. It's interesting to think about that here was a nation that was imploding. God still got purpose for them, so He spares them for a period of time in order to allow for that. Their interest in Syria, though, as we stated, is more about getting towards Egypt. So here's the Assyrian Empire, okay, that eventually comes about. And all that you see in green to the north, and their conquest clear down into trying to take over Egypt, down to the bottom left of that map. And so you got to go right through Palestine in order to do that. You've got to go right through Judea and right through this region that we're talking about in order to accomplish that. And so, in very fierce ways, they're striving to accomplish those ends. They desired more and more power. The more they desired the power, the more wicked they became. As the years passed and God's people became more wicked themselves, God chose to use Assyria as His weapon of punishment. And they were a threat to Israel as early as the reign of Omri, the sixth king, and continued to be such. The threat of Assyria was constantly on the horizon. If you can imagine, to me, to be honest with you, to me, it's a lot like Israel today. Israel today is surrounded by what? All kinds of nations that want what? To do away with them, right? They are situated in a location where many, let's not overstate the case, not all of them, not all of the Middle East wants to see Israel wiped off the map, but much of it does, and some have been very outspoken about that. And so just like in some ways today, there's this constant antagonistic relationship with surrounding neighbors. Israel was going through that as well in the Old Testament, where here's Assyria constantly antagonizing, and the Syrians as well in relationship to that. It did not come closer to Israel during the years while Syria was Israel's most imminent danger. As long as the Assyrians were around, it was kind of, Syria was the major problem until ultimately the Assyrians will take over everybody in the process. Assyria was plagued with problems of their own during this time period, weakness in administration, fighting their own battles. That's what we referenced a little while ago. And so there was issues. Jonah goes, right? And he cries. Whoops, I forgot to move that circle. I can't move it for you. Let me recircle Nineveh on the map for you. Because I forgot to move. When I enlarged the map, I forgot to move where the circle was. So if you can see the red circle, Nineveh is right in the center of it. Okay, that's Nineveh. All right? And during the time when Jeroboam II was king in Israel, God spoke to a prophet in Israel, Jonah, telling him to go cry out against Nineveh. And after finally obeying God's instructions, Nineveh repents, as you recall, at Jonah's message, and was spared destruction. And serves the purposes of God moving forward. And so they continue to be part of the plan and purposes of God. So prophets continued to denounce the people, but they wouldn't listen. They wouldn't adhere to the things that were saying. Amos said destruction's imminent if you don't get yourself straightened around with God. But they had forgotten. They were no longer obeying or worshiping the God whose protection they wanted. They had just become so distant. Israel had become so distant and so disconnected from God. It didn't matter to them anymore. And though the prophets begged and pleaded and encouraged and warned, it started to have no effect. So Jeroboam II dies, and the bubble of prosperity bursts. It's amazing what a financial crisis in any nation will cause. And here's what's happening. Jeroboam II, remember we said earlier, his kingdom was as large as David's. And so prosperity and good things. He dies, prosperity bubble bursts, and now there's challenge on the horizon. His son was murdered by a man named Shalem, who was in turn murdered by Manasseh. It gets ugly for a period of time leading up to the demise of Israel. Pul comes to the throne of Nineveh, the title of Tiglath-Pileser III. And so anytime you see, by the way, that term, Tiglath-Pileser, you'll see it several times. That's not a name, that's a title. Okay? Just like Pharaoh. Pharaoh isn't a name, Pharaoh is a title. And so when you see that term Tiglath-Pileser, you're talking about a title. And he's the third to bear that title as ruler in Nineveh. And he made 3 raids across Canaan between 734 and 732, roughly 9, is that right? No, 11, because I got to go the other direction. 11 years prior to the ultimate fall of Israel. So Tiglath-Pileser marched to the sea. He turned south along the shore and conquered the Philistines. He proceeds on down to Egypt, and he left a presence there. And he comes back to deal Israel a direct blow. So, and let me see if I've got a map somewhere quick here. No, I got information, no map. Remember, the Philistines are over on the shore, okay? They're over on the west. They're on the shore. So he kind of bypasses Judea and goes down through the Philistines and gets down here to Egypt. And then once he's there, he kind of establishes a base, military base, for lack of a better description. And he fortifies himself, and he comes back up to deal with Israel at full strength and ready to go. And so he comes back and deals a direct blow. The Assyrians took Ijon, Elbet, all those places. You pronounce them however you want to. But takes all of those areas. All of the northern Israel's gone. All the coastal plain, gone. All of Israel's eastern territories, gone. And they burned the cities and took the people captive. The Assyrian troops came back later and took Damascus. They killed Rezin and took the people captive again. Hoshea comes to the throne in Israel. He remains loyal to the Assyrians until that particular Tiglath-Pileser had died. He then rebels and hoped for help from Egypt, but guess what? Doesn't happen. Made his allegiance with Egypt, hoping they would come to his rescue. Didn't happen. And so the armies returned and besieged them there at Samaria. And Samaria in particular is right here where the red circle is. They hold out for 3 years before collapsing. I want you to think about how long a siege that must have been and what that had to have been like. Imagine And imagine it in times not nearly as modern as these times that we live in. Imagine how difficult it would be today, but then just intensify a 3-year siege in their day and the challenges that would present. But they held out for quite a long period of time before they finally will fall. Shalmaneser was the name of the king who laid siege to Samaria. He died before the task was completed. Sargon II takes his place there as leader of Assyria. Isaiah mentions him, specifically in Isaiah chapter 20 and verse 1. And his records, speaking of this Sargon II, his records tell of the fall of Samaria were found in the mid-1800s. And so not all that long ago, we find, surprise, surprise, the records of Sargon II. Guess what he talks about? Siege at Samaria. In the records and chronicles of that king of Assyria, he chronicles and talks about this history that the Bible speaks of as well. At the beginning of my rule, these were his words put into English. At the beginning of my rule, in the very first year I reigned, I set siege to and conquered Samaria. I carried away into captivity 27,290 persons who lived there. I took 50 fine chariots for my royal equipment. And so, quoting this Sargon II, talking about how he dealt with Samaria in that particular time. So ultimately, God's word comes true. The destruction that He had set for them, the kingdom of Israel has fallen, never to be rebuilt. It's gone. Never to exist again. The people were captive. They were scattered throughout all the land because they had forsaken God. And His judgment came upon them. And difficulties arose to them because of their rejection of Jehovah. In 2 Kings chapter 17, verses 7 through 23, you see the description of why it was that God decided to destroy Israel. They had sinned against Him. They had feared other gods rather than Jehovah. They'd walked in the statutes of the nations around them rather than in the statutes of God. They secretly did things which were not right. They tried to secretly go about doing things that were against God's will. They set up for themselves sacred pillars and wooden images. They served idols. They would not listen. They stiffened their necks towards the prophets. They rejected the statutes and covenants of God. They left all the commandments of the Lord. Eventually, none of it left to be fulfilled. And they made for themselves a molded image and 2 calves, walked in all the sins of Jeroboam, and faced the consequences because of it. But that's just Israel. Okay? That's a fast history of the destruction, very fast history of the destruction of Israel. But Judah survives a little longer, right? Judah doesn't find its demise until about 586 BC. So you're dealing with a period of time here. I'm trying to do the quick math. I should have done this earlier. About 135 odd years later that Judah falls. So 721 with Israel. Judah lasts longer, but they're going to fall as well. And again, let's briefly run through this history. I realize it's just information overload, but trust me, if you pick up 4 or 5 thoughts from each, then at least you'll have a mindset of being able to know where Jeremiah fits in this picture. So Israel's gone, okay? Bad kings all the way through, forgot God, worshipped idols, sinned against Him. Syrians caused problems for him, Assyria decides, I'm just going to take them. And eventually takes over Israel. But Judah's still surviving. Judah consists of what 2 tribes, by the way? Judah and Benjamin, right? So Judah and Benjamin are considered the southern tribes. There's always one challenge with that when we call them the southern tribes. What is it? In terms of geography and the tribes. Okay. Well, who's below them? Simeon. History doesn't tell us a lot about what exactly happened to Simeon and why he's not really under discussion when you talk about the divided kingdom. I don't have an answer for that. Why the southern tribes, the southern kingdoms consider Judah and Benjamin when you study it in Scripture. the northern tribes are all those others that are to the north. Simeon seems to just have dissolved and kind of just either absorbed into Judah, which is probably the most likely thing, but doesn't really get much reference after the divided kingdom period. So they feel the heavy hand of Assyria. And they might have fallen soon after Israel if their kings hadn't been as wicked as Ahaz, or had been as wicked as Ahaz, who appealed to Tiglath-Pileser for his help. They were also troubled by rage from the Edomites and the Philistines. And remember, I talked about the Philistines, and they're over here in that region of Ashdod. So they're dealing Judah's problems, Syria and Assyria to the north, causing trouble for Israel. Judah's problems come from east and southwest, or southeast, I should say, in the west, where Ashdod, the Philistines, and the Edomites seem to be their biggest challengers over a period of time. Fortunately, though, for Judah, they had a good king once in a while. Hezekiah, who was as righteous as his father Ahaz was wicked, he realized where their blessings came from. He knew that God was the reason why the nation would survive or not survive. And so he used that to his advantage. In 2 Chronicles chapter 29, our fathers have trespassed and done evil in the eyes of the Lord our God. They have forsaken Him. Therefore the wrath of our Lord fell upon Judah and Jerusalem. And He has given them up to trouble, to desolation, and to jeering. Because of this our fathers have fallen by the sword, and our sons, our daughters, and our wives are in captivity. Now it is in my heart to make a covenant with the Lord God of Israel, that His fierce wrath may turn away from us. He realized what had happened to the north. And he realizes it wasn't just because of the Syrians or the Assyrians, it was because they'd abandoned God. And he knew if Judah was going to survive, he needed to get them back in relationship with God. And strove to do that. Right. He had good prophets working with him, hand in hand in accomplishing that work. Hezekiah cleansed the temple, restored the worship, destroyed the idols in the land, and he invited all the people from Beersheba to Dan to celebrate the Passover. People came from all parts of the region, and the Bible says there was none like it since the days of David and Solomon. The festival of the Passover being remembered. Hezekiah realizing the importance of getting the people back to the worship that God had designed. His reforms were taking place in Judah during the last few years before Israel's fall. So he can kind of see what's happening with his brother nation up here in Israel. And he can kind of see what's going on. He's thinking, I don't want that for Judah. And so he's making changes. Israel, stiff-necked, didn't care. Prophets came, Amos comes. They come and tell him, warn them, imminent danger, ignored it all. He's paying attention. And he saved the people, at least for a little while longer. Samaria fell in the 6th year of Hezekiah's reign. So the 6th year of Hezekiah's reign, we just talked a moment ago about how finally they come and overrun Syria. Sargon II comes, takes over Samaria. Well, Hezekiah in Judah is in his 6th year when that fall of Israel occurs. At this point in history, all the little countries of Palestine had fallen completely to the Assyrians, and they were paying enormous tribute. The reason for that was the Assyrians were a little different than others in their approach to things. And if you want to survive, you're going to pay heavy tribute in order to do that. Syria and Israel are now gone. The Assyrians have taken over everybody in that region. Syria's gone. Israel's gone. Tyre stood, but most of Phoenicia's gone. A few Philistine cities are still standing. Moab, Ammon, Edom, and Judah, they all continued with their own kings, but they're already paying tribute to Assyria. They're allowed to kind of self-govern and rule, but Assyria is basically there every day with their hand out. Pay the tribute or we're coming. And so that's what you did in order to survive. So Ashdod and Egypt, they decide that they're going to make a coalition to go against Assyria. And Judah and Edom and Moab seem to have given tentative support to this. However, Ashdod and other towns fell under the scourge. They were the ones that really take the brunt. And the area was made a new province of Assyria. And so now they've gone from just being here to the north. Let me step out of the way of the map. or walk up to it. But so here's all, I mean, you look at all this mass. Here's Judah, okay, here's Jerusalem. All right? Judah's just got a little bit to the north of Jerusalem left. The land of the south lost everything towards the sea, and all this region to the north. So Assyria says, Ashdod, you want to fight? Fine. And they come down and just take over. So now there's no real allegiance towards the seaports of the Mediterranean for Judah to turn to. All of it down by, through that coastline, is now under Assyrian rule. At this same time, King Sargon of Assyria was having trouble on the other end of his empire. The difficulty of growing an empire is what? You got to fight it on both ends. The bigger you get, the harder it is to keep control of it. And so he's got problems on the other side. So the Babylon was rebelled and set up an independent state. And struggle between Nineveh and Babylon lasted about 12 years before Babylon was subdued initially. And so Assyria, Judah and others get a little bit of a breath because Assyria's got to deal with Babylon for about 12 years. So you get some breaks in time where you're not being pressured so much because there's bigger problems and bigger challenges in the empire in order to deal with. During this time, Egypt was reasserting its power. Why would you reassert your power when Assyria's up here fighting in Babylon? All right, because they're weak, in your mind anyway. They're in a weakened state. This is the time to go. Let's attack now. If we're going to get ourselves back out of underneath all this tribute, let's go do it now because they're dealing with other things. So Egypt says, all right, let's try this. They wanted a buffer state between herself and Assyria to the north. So who is that? That's Israel and Judah. That's Judea. Okay? So they're telling all these little nations of Canaan to rebel. You guys rebel. Isaiah begged them. Kevin mentioned earlier about how Isaiah was encouraging the kings of Judah during this time period. Isaiah urges King Hezekiah not to listen to Egypt. But there was a pro-Egyptian party in the land. And so Hezekiah withheld his tribute from Assyria and began making fortifications throughout his territory. And in the 14th year of Hezekiah's reign, armies came in mass, this time under King Sennacherib. And they destroyed the city of Tyre, then Joppa. They met and defeated an Egyptian army along the way, laid siege to Judah's walled cities, shut up Jerusalem like a bird in a cage. You ever seen a bird in a cage? Doesn't look very free, does it? Confined. And some of their armies devastated the countryside along the way. And they're realizing his danger. Hezekiah sent a huge tribute to the king camped at Lachish. Stripped the gold from the walls of the temple for resources, but it wasn't enough. Sennacherib says, too late, basically. Not sufficient, not satisfied with an attempt to come back and now pay your tribute. Should have been doing that all along. So Judah's in trouble. Everything looks like it's all going to fall apart. So Hezekiah went to Jehovah in prayer for help, and God answered with a promise in Isaiah 37, 33 through 35. And as God promised in that text, He struck down the Assyrian host with a plague. Sennacherib awoke one morning to find 185,000 of his soldiers dead. You can imagine. One night you go to sleep and there's 185,000 warriors out here ready to go to battle and do your bidding. Wake up the next morning and they're all dead. Pretty rough day for a military man. So he withdraws from the land and never went back. He didn't return. Jerusalem was spared then for another 100 years, but the toll had been high. Sennacherib's records boast of 46 walled cities and forts taken on the raid. Much of the land was in ashes. And so they may have appeals to God. God saves them from Sennacherib, but the damage had been done. Much of the walled cities and fortified places had already been destroyed and left in piles and ruins. And so there's not a lot of Judah left in terms of value. And so just to give you some comparison, and I'll run back up here for a second. What you're seeing over here on this screen, and you've probably seen this lots of times in your Bible maps and so forth. This is what the land looked like when they divvied it all up. Okay, right? They crossed at Jericho, right? They began the conquest. They first came south, I believe, and then they returned north to take over the land. Remember, on this side of Jordan, remember Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh? They wanted to stay on that side of the river. What was the deal? You're going to fight, and not only you're going to help fight, you're going to what? You're going to the front lines. You're not going to be patting us on the back from way back here. If you want to stay over here, you're still going to go help us conquer the land that God had promised. So they come over. So here's Dan, here's Benjamin, Ephraim, Manasseh, Issachar, Zebulun, Asher, Naphtali. Okay, this is what the nation was when God gave it to them. At the point in history we're talking about, this tan area is all that's left. That's all that's left. Of all that land that God had promised them when they went in and conquest over the land, all that you see on the right-hand side of the screen that God had blessed them with, it's all now in the hands of somebody else, except for that small little portion of Judah left there at the bottom. It's sad to think about the promises of God that He had given them, and all they had to do was honor God, and they could have had it for as long as the world would stand. But it didn't work that way. And God understood, I suppose, and you understand the plans of God in that sense. Sometimes we talk about the Aramaic language. Talk about the Bible being written in 3 languages, right? Hebrew, Aramaic, and what else? In the New Testament in Greek, right? So why Aramaic? Well, it comes about around 2 Kings chapter 18 and verse 26. There are some Israelite officials asked the Assyrians to speak in the Syrian or Aramaic language, not the Jewish language, not the Hebrew language, because they didn't want some folks around them to know what it was that was being said. And so that's when you kind of have this ushering in of this mix of people speaking Hebrew and Aramaic, and that's why some of the Old Testament is found in both languages. This language was spoken by most of the people in the northern Mesopotamia and Syria. All this area that we have been studying was either captive of or subject to the Assyrians. Everybody's being run over from this point forward. Here's a term we use all the time, but it's interesting. You don't see it until 2 Kings chapter 16, verse 6. I believe it's the first time that you see the term Jew being used, and it was not used initially to reference all of the Israelites. It was used initially as a shortened version of Judah. Okay? It was originally used as a shortened version of Judah. That's who we're dealing with right now. The southern tribe remaining, Judah, the southern kingdom, Judah. And that's when this word begins to be used. And it wasn't really used generically until later on in time. Okay. So Hezekiah was followed by his son Manasseh, who reigned for 55 years. He was the most wicked king Judah ever had. He revived idol worship, built altars to all kinds of idols inside the temple grounds, sacrificed his own sons to Moloch, practiced sorcery, witchcraft, divination. He was cruel and unjust in everything that he did. He filled Jerusalem with the blood of innocent people, and God declared he was worse than the Amorites that had been driven out of Canaan in Joshua's day. I simply want to illustrate to you, okay, we're almost to Jeremiah. Okay, we're right at him. But this is the condition of God's people. Israel sinned, and sinned some more. God said, I'm done. And they become destroyed. Judah had some good kings that kept them on the good road for a while. But Hezekiah is followed by his son Manasseh, and God's description of him is, you're worse than the people that I ran out of there to begin with. Now you think about that. How bad had you have to become that you were worse than the Amorites that had been driven out of Canaan in the days of Joshua? It's amazing. Yeah. He's not quite working yet, but Jeremiah is now breathing his first breath, most likely in this time period during Manasseh's reign. So he remained loyal to Assyria, but he's later taken prisoner, had a hook put on his nose, bound in shackles, taken to Babylon. God dealt with him. While in Babylon, he turned his heart to seek Jehovah. God heard his prayer and later released and allowed to come back to his throne. He spent the last few years of his life trying to destroy the idols he had set up and to undo the evil that he had done. He's an interesting case in a lot of ways. One moment described as the most wicked they'd ever seen, more wicked than the Amorites that they drove out of the land to begin with. But he does have a change. People can turn from pretty drastic wickedness. That's the lesson of him. People don't have to stay wicked. And they can be as wicked as all get out. And they could be more wicked than others before them. But he comes back and he tries. And he prays. And he spent the last few years of his life trying to do everything he could to erase the problems that he had created. But his son Ammon comes to the throne. He's wicked. He reigned only 2 years and he was killed. Then Josiah. Josiah comes to the throne when he's 8 years old. And he's determined, I'm going to serve God. He destroys the idols throughout the land. He gave orders that the temple be cleansed. And while they're doing that, the workers found an ancient copy of the law of Moses. Josiah was terrified when he heard it read. As though he had never heard it before because he hadn't. The people had completely lost touch with God's law. Huldah the prophetess told him that the law was correct. God was angry and too late. It's too late for punishment to be averted. Postponed because of Josiah's faithfulness, but God's done. The destruction's coming. So Josiah renewed his efforts to clean up his land. He calls the people together and led them in renewing their covenant with God. He stopped the worship of Moloch, went to the altar at Bethel and destroyed that sanctuary that had been built by Jeroboam I for his golden calves, burned the bones of false prophet or priest, destroyed the high places of false gods that Solomon had built for his wives nearly 300 years earlier. He was the best in many ways King Judah ever had. Started at a young age, but may have very well have been the best they ever had. Meanwhile, Assyria is having troubles of her own. Egypt strove for independence. Medes are growing in strength. Rebellions from the city of Babylon. Trouble everywhere. That's the point. Trouble everywhere from every side. And the kings of Assyria are starting to be unable to hold their kingdom together. Revolts continued. A Chaldean prince named Nabopolassar managed to gain independence for Babylon. He joins forces with the Medes and they laid siege to the city of Nineveh. And it fell after only 3 months, never to rise again in 612 BC. So a victorious battle at Carchemish marked Assyria's end. Josiah was reigning in Judah during these last years of Assyrian struggle. So Josiah's in place and power when the Assyrians fall. Jeremiah the prophet starting to come on the scene. Judah was relieved when Nineveh fell. The book of Nahum is a whole book basically expressing how wonderful it was when the news spread that Nineveh had fallen. Egypt's rejoicing over the fall of Assyria. But Babylon is growing quickly. I'm just skipping through because we're running out of time. So the Jews placed Josiah's son Jehoahaz, after Josiah dies, on the throne. 3 months later, Necho put Jehoahaz's brother Jehoiakim on the throne and took Jehoahaz as prisoner to Egypt. Babylon and Media agreed to coexist. We're just going to get along. Okay, the Median Empire's up here to the north. Okay, it's this light pinkish area here. Here's the Babylonian Empire. They basically say, hey, why fight? And so they agree to kind of coexist for a period of time. All those challenges that they had seen earlier are starting to step away. Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, he's able to secure all the land until he comes to Egypt. But he can't seem to beat Egypt for a period of time. Trouble's mounting in Judah now in all of this process. There are periods of captivities. In fact, I believe there are 3 periods of captivities that Judah begins to see. The Babylonians take a first wave, a second wave, and then finally the ultimate end. In that first wave, that's Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego. Taken in that first wave of those taken captive. So some are taken captive and live as Babylonians. Some, I believe Ezekiel writes about some, but some live, for lack of a better, in kind of an exile, and some are allowed to stay. Jeremiah is prophesying from where? From Jerusalem. Okay, he stays. Some get sent away. Jeremiah stays. So when Josiah is in rule, Jehoiakim, Jehoiachin, all these guys, that's when Jeremiah is prophesying. In the very last days, and ultimately in the beginning of the captivity to Babylon, is when you see Jeremiah speaking. Ezekiel's a contemporary. We've also mentioned others that are contemporaries as well. So Jeremiah becomes God's spokesman during this time. The Israelites were not going to listen. They just were not interested in what Jeremiah had to say. So Babylon came again in 586 BC. Basically, and we're going to learn, Jeremiah says, don't resist, and we'll get through this. But they couldn't help themselves for whatever reason. That's right. They labeled him as a traitor and said, we're going to fight anyway. And they fall in 586 because of it. And are held captive for how long? 70 years. Who tells us that? Jeremiah does. Jeremiah does. All right. Right? Okay. We got there. Again, I don't expect you to remember all that. I can't remember all. I'd have to take a time to stop and think about all those. But all I was trying to do tonight is make sure now you know. Where's Jeremiah fit? Israel went through all kinds of trouble. Sinned against God. Finally, God says what in 721 BC? We're done. Who did them in? The Assyrians. Okay? For about 135 some odd years after that, Judah has a period of peace. Why were they have a period of peace? Because they had some good kings. Predominantly, initially, Hezekiah. Ultimately, Josiah. But eventually the wickedness returns. And by the time, Manasseh caused some difficulties for the people. Manasseh, in between Hezekiah and Josiah, his difficulties, eventually God says, I'm done, and I'm not what? I'm not turning back from it. Okay? You're going to be taken captive. I'm taking you down, and I'm not turning back from it. Josiah is a great king, and he spares them for a period of time. But it was written in stone by that point. God says, I'm done. So Jeremiah is going to prophesy in that time period where God has already brought judgment, and Jeremiah is begging the people, let's just endure through this. God said it's going to be 70 years. Let's endure through it, and God will restore us. And they resisted the message. We're very ugly, for lack of a better description, towards Jeremiah. It's no wonder he's known as what? The weeping prophet. Okay. So now, you don't have to do all that, Kevin, Sunday. So when you come back, Lord willing, Sunday, and Kevin's going to teach the class on Sunday, now you can start. Now you've got all the hundreds of years of history prior. At least you've got pieces of it in your mind. You can come back now Sunday, Lord willing, and start talking about Jeremiah in specific. And you get to talk about who he is and all those aspects about him too. Because I thought I'd get there, but I didn't. Okay.